Does anyone play or used to play the video game Street Fighter? I remember back when I was like 8 to 10 years old. I played that game so much on PlayStation. I was even Ryu one time for Halloween. One day, when I was in my living room by myself, I kept doing Hadoukens over and over. A Hadouken is when a player shoots out a ball of electricity or some blue shit, and it flies across the screen to hit the other player. Hadouken! Well, I remember trying really hard this day to actually do a Hadouken. I swear, on my life, after doing this a million times in my living room, an actual blue ball of light shot out of my hands and slowly floated across the room and out the wall. It didn't damage anything or make any sounds. I remember just staring at it in awe, not believing what I was seeing. I know kids have crazy imaginations, but do they really lead to casual hallucinations in the middle of the day? Anyone else ever willed something so hard as a kid that it actually appeared in reality? Hadouken! After recently moving out of our previous house, and with no incidents in the month since moving, I feel like I'm ready to share my story. Essentially, in the house my family used to live in, there was some sort of entity that could shapeshift and look like, or mimic, people and animals. The first encounter happened in late 2019, after we had already lived in the house for well over a decade. I was in bed with my girlfriend. We hadn't yet fallen asleep that night, and I was getting out of bed to go to the toilet before going to sleep. On the way out, I turned off the light. When I returned and opened the door, she called out and asked who was coming in. I responded that it was obviously me, and she screamed, so I turned on the light. She was freaking out, so I asked her what was going on. She said that a couple of minutes before I got back, someone, who she presumed was me, had entered the room, got into bed, and started cuddling up to her. When I actually came back and she realized that she wasn't laying next to me, she moved as far away as possible. But when I turned the light on, no one was in the room beside us. She said it felt just like me cuddling up to her. We ended up staying at her place that night, and she refused to ever come back. The next incident happened on the 11th of July, 2020. I looked up the date of a football game that was on to pinpoint the exact date. I was watching the TV by myself when my dad opened the door and stood in the doorway. I wasn't paying much attention to him and absentmindedly asked him if he had ended up watching the end of the game his team was playing in. They had made a pretty good comeback. He didn't respond, so I looked over at him and noticed that he was wearing one of my shirts, which was weird because it's not something that he'd ever done before. I then looked down and noticed that both of his legs were there. He had a leg amputated in 2017. Normally, he'd have a fake leg, one that is basically just a metal pole with a foot on the end, not one you could mistake for an actual leg. I must have had a serious look of shock on my face, because right after looking at his legs and noticing what was wrong, he backed away and slammed the door. I ran down to the back shed where my dad was earlier and found him still there. I asked him if he had just been in the house. He said that he hadn't left the shed in hours. I didn't want to tell him what happened, so I just said I thought I'd heard him calling. I found the shirt that Dad was wearing on my floor with a bunch of other dirty clothes. The next case also involves the mimic pretending to be my dad. My dad is a diabetic and will occasionally have a hypo where he becomes non-responsive, and it can sort of feel like talking to a child who will hardly respond and doesn't know where they are or what's going on. My mom found him sitting on the couch, and he wouldn't respond to her when she talked or nudged him, so she was worried that he was having a hypo. She went out to the kitchen to get insulin, but when she returned, he wasn't on the couch. She then freaked out because she couldn't find him. After searching for a few minutes, she tried calling him, hoping that his phone was on him and she'd be able to hear it. My dad answered his phone. He'd been at work the whole time. The last encounter we had was a couple of months ago, about a week after our dog had passed away. She died of old age, if you were wondering. We were in the kitchen, from where you could see down the hallway. Leading off the hallway is another short hallway part, with a door on the end where our dog's doggy door was. We heard the doggy door open, which was strange, as we only had the one pet, who had obviously just passed away. We looked down the hall and saw what looked exactly like our dog. My mom was beside herself with fright and said, "Now it looks like Molly." I was scared too, but aggressively said to it, "We know you're not her. She's dead. Fuck off." Then, it made a horrifying noise. It sounded like a cat who had had its tail stomped on. It then bolted out of sight and through the doggy door. My mom and dad decided that they wanted to move, so luckily we were able to move out about a month ago. I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary since that last incident, so I'm hoping it was attached more to the house than to us. I've recently tried to discuss this story with my boyfriend, but I don't feel any relief about what happened to me in high school. He tries to explain it away as a group hallucination or someone pulling a prank on my friends and I, but I know deep down what happened was unfortunately real, and it still gives me great anxiety when I think about it. This story took place in Lower Alabama when I was in high school, almost 8 years ago, but I still remember every detail like it happened moments ago. The 3 friends and I were making the trip to our other friend's house, way out in the boondocks, probably 30 minutes outside of any nearby city or town. There's only one road that takes you to his house, and it's just a long strip of old concrete, and that's in dire need of repair. But considering only a handful of people live out there, why would the state waste their time and money? On both sides of the road, it's just dense forest that creeps to the edge of the road sometimes, with hardly nowhere to pull off, and absolutely no streetlights. We were in my friend's brand new Red Mustang that he had got for his birthday, and he was proud to drive us all around wherever we wanted to go. It was him, we'll call him Jamie, driving. My friend, we'll call him Dave, in the passenger seat. And myself and my other friend, we'll call her Mary, crammed in the back seat, among his giant sound system. No seatbelts, just half standing, half sitting in the floorboards. It was very uncomfortable, and the rattling of the music shook my entire body. But I was just happy that one of us had a vehicle to take us to our friend's house. We turned onto the long strip of road that would take us there, and was very disappointed that there was another car not too far ahead of us, which meant Jamie couldn't show us how fast his new car could go. Although there's no crazy turns or curves in the road, it's solid white line the whole way because of the endless hills, making it impossible to pass anyone. We accepted that we'd have to go the speed limit, and Jamie finally turned the music down so we could talk shit about the tiny red Toyota that we'd be staring at the back of for about half an hour. It's about 9 p.m., and there was no moon visible through the dense clouds, so it was pitch black besides our headlights and the car in front of us with its own lights, which theirs were bright because I'm sure of the tons of deer that live out there. No other vehicles came from the other direction, and no one was behind us. We drove for only about 10 minutes, cutting up and hardly paying attention to the road, since we knew where we were going. Suddenly, the car in front of us slams on their brakes, skidding their tires, and stopping in the middle of the road. Jamie wasn't following too closely, so We didn't have to do the same, but we came to a slow stop, maybe 15 feet behind them. There was a brief pause, and before we heard a woman's blood-curdling scream coming from the Toyota. We had the windows down because some of us had been smoking cigarettes. And that's when we saw it. We had stopped on a declining hill, so we could see in front of the Toyota. And what we saw, I'll never be able to forget. It was some kind of humanoid-looking creature, standing on all fours, but the arch of its back was taller than the little Toyota. The only thing that made it humanoid was its hairless skin, but it was very pale, almost gray, very wrinkly, and its limbs were impossibly long. Its forearm was longer than any human's entire arm. The legs, fingers, arms, neck, everything looked like stretched taffy, and we could see all the bones through its skin, especially the backbones that were almost spike-like because they jutted out so much. It wasn't facing us, just stopped mid-stride in the middle of the road, facing the right side of the forest. It had backwards facing knees like bird's legs, no tail, but still had the posture of some kind of animal. I hope to God it was an animal, but there's no animal in Alabama that would be taller than a car on all fours. And like I said, it had human-like skin, hands, feet, and its head was like a human skull. No one in our car said a word, and Jamie instinctively hit the lock button for the doors, though our windows were still down, and the woman in the Toyota was still screaming bloody murder. For a moment, I remember telling myself it was just some kind of fucked up prank or weird art sculpture or something because it wasn't moving at all. But then, those thoughts quickly dissipated when the thing cocked its head in our direction. Its face was just as terrible as the rest of its body, pale and wrinkly, just an indentation for a nose, and tiny black holes for eyes, no ears, and an impossibly large, red-stained mouth that formed into a wicked smile, showing multiple rows of pointed teeth. The woman's scream grew terribly louder at that moment, and the thing seemed to finally be almost startled by it, turning its head back toward the forest, taking only about 2 giant, fluid animal-like steps, and disappearing into the woods on the right, without making a sound. As soon as it was out of sight, Jamie slowly crept the Mustang forward, around the still-stopped Toyota, and we saw a man and woman frantically arguing and crying in the front seat. When we got in front of them, the man put the Toyota in reverse and goes a bit off-road to turn around and floors it in the direction we came. Apparently, where they were headed wasn't important enough. I almost thought we should do the same, but I couldn't get myself to make a sound, let alone a word or a sentence. Jamie went only about 5 miles over the speed limit as he rolled the windows up, and no one said a word for the rest of the 20-minute drive. When we finally got to our friend's house, he was waiting outside for us as we pulled into the little dirt driveway. All 4 of us scrambled out, pushing past him to get inside the house. I remember him saying something like, "Whoa, it looks like you guys saw a ghost or something." Dave turns to him with the most serious face and says, "Or something, yeah." We got inside, and part of me was still thinking it was some sort of hallucination, even though we hadn't drank or smoked that day at all. So being the artist of the group, I asked our friend for paper and pencils. Without question, he retrieved them, and while sitting in his living room, I suggested that we all try to draw exactly what we saw before we tried to discuss anything. Sure enough, each of us drew the exact same creature and showed it to our friend before explaining the full story. He was horrified and took the drawings out back to a small fire pit and lit them ablaze. None of us protested because we never wanted a visual of that thing again. He asked us things like, had we been drugged, or were we pulling a fast one on him? But considering that there were 2 people that saw the same thing, and most of us were to the point of tears, he knew we weren't lying. He led us back inside, locked his doors and windows, and put on a movie to distract us. But we kept bringing it up, trying to make any sense out of it, and got hardly any sleep at all. Jamie took us all home the next day, and we saw the Toyota's black skid marks on the road where it had happened, confirming that it wasn't an elaborate shared dream. And before we dropped off Mary, she told us that she didn't want to hang out with us anymore, simply because being around us would remind her of it. We sort of just nodded, and I honestly haven't spoken to her since. I rarely speak to the two friends anymore for other reasons, but a few times I've tried to bring it up to them, and they refuse to talk about it. I know they know it happened. It's just too painful for them to discuss, which is understandable. I hate talking about it to this day, and have only told two of my closest friends, and my now boyfriend, who's very opposed to any supernatural things. So you can understand why I didn't get any relief by talking to him about it. I never really believed in those sort of things either before that incident, but it's definitely changed my perspective a bit. Please let me know if any of you have seen something similar. I've tried researching it, and people keep saying it's a skinwalker, a rake, a wendigo, but the descriptions never fully match up. I guess I just like to put a name to whatever that terrible thing that prowls lower Alabama's woods was. This happened back around 2007. I was 16 at the time, and some girlfriends and I decided to make our own Ouija board. It was the weekend, and we decided to take it to the grounds at the local high school instead of doing it at my friend's house. Thank God we at least had that sense. We set up and had the glass upside down with all of our pinky fingers on top. It moved, but I can't remember if or what it spelled. I've also felt skeptical about this before because you never really know if someone is just moving the glass. But all three of us agreed that we weren't manipulating it. While we were performing our little seance, we see this kid playing basketball within our sight. One of my friends recognized him and said his little brother died within the last year or so. The strange thing was this boy was alone and just shooting hoops, but over near one of the buildings was a kid that appeared to be about 10 years old, just watching him. The boy played basketball by himself for a while and then left, never interacting with the younger boy. But the 10-year-old followed behind him when he left, but kind of from a distance, and still never actually interacting. My friends and I finished up, and I went home later that afternoon. I was sleeping alone in my room that night when I woke up with my eyes still closed, and I could hear what I would describe as children's music. It was like the music that's in one of those old music boxes that plays a melody when it's opened. I opened my eyes, and what I saw scared the absolute hell out of me. Right next to my bed, standing over me, was a completely black silhouette, about the size of a 10-year-old boy. I was so afraid, all I could manage to do was shut my eyes and just lie there, eventually rolling over to face the wall and cover myself in blankets while I silently cried. I managed to fall asleep again at some point and woke up in the safety of the daylight. It never visited me again, and I'm not sure it was the boy or if it was something else in that shape. I have never done another Ouija board, fuck that, and I think it scared me so much that I don't know if I'll be able to see a spirit again. My mom told me when I was young, 3 or 4, that I would tell her that my late grandfather would sit on the end of my bed and talk to me. So, I know I have the capability to speak to people from the spirit world. I just think about what happened that night, and I was so terrified. I think I may have a blockage now to protect me from ever feeling so afraid again. I may seem out of my mind. I feel like I am. The first night I heard it was the end of the summer of 2019. I was building my own art studio in the back of this old building. One night, I stepped out onto the back deck to clean up. I was staring off into the woods that ran right up next to the steps leading up to my studio. I heard something let loose, this immense, deep howling off in the distance. It had such a blood-curdling effect on the air around me, it gave me goosebumps and raised every hair on my body. And shortly after it went silent, I heard all the dogs in a 1 to 2 mile radius barking, yipping, and howling in the direction of that roar or howl. There's no way it was a wolf or any large cat. I've heard videos and sound bites of wildcats or mountain lions making those demonic type sounds, and that wasn't this. This was a roar of a human-animal mix. I could hear it in his voice. The area of Ohio I'm in isn't a place where you'd see any large cat or let alone hear one. My first thought was, that's the Wendigo coming to get me. And I don't know why that popped in my head like that. And a countless other number of things have been happening more and more. Almost like intuition or something in my head. 4 weeks prior to the weirdest shit I've ever experienced, I was approached by a man about commissioning 3 art pieces of something I wasn't familiar with at all. Wendigos. More specifically, a wartime Wendigo, where it's this huge 1,000-foot tall creature, taller than a skyscraper. And it's made out of all of us, body parts sticking out all over it, a face here and there. It was supposed to represent all of our greed and insatiable desire or want for more. Sadly, I didn't have the time to work on these pieces, so I passed. But it started reminding me of my own monster that's been following me my whole life. I made some drawings of a dream night terror I had a week before this man approached me to turn us all into the Wendigo. In my dream, it was a tall, emaciated creature with animal-like legs and human-like arms, crouching in my kitchen like a dog would sit and looking at my cabinets. "What the hell are you doing, dude?" I asked it. "Chill the fuck out. I'm looking for some chips or something. I'm fucking starving," it replied. I sat up quickly and threw the blanket off me. It turned to look at me, and the way it looked was indescribable, but I took in every detail that I could. It had large, black holes where the eyes were supposed to be, and just a jagged slit across the lower side of its face that represented a mouth with no lips, and thousands of rows of jagged teeth curled around its gums, with a long tongue sliding out between them. It let out a gurgled, squelching scream. Then, all of a sudden, black smoky tendrils shot out of where its hair was supposed to be on its head, lingered for a second, and sucked back in toward its body. Then boom, it vanished. I made drawings of it as soon as I woke up and was trying to put the pieces together as to why it was in my kitchen. And at that moment, the hair on my body stood on end, because I had an unanswered email about commissioning some artwork based on this creature. Fast forward to June 2020. Corona has taken over the world, and I'm sure I've lost my mind. I forgot all about it, and I'm hanging out with a friend at 3 o'clock in the morning. After months of not seeing or talking to anyone, it seems, we went to White Castle for a quick bite. She walks out first and hits the bottom step. As I'm walking out, locking the door, I hear something breaking tree limbs, crashing through them. Not fast, but not slow, and definitely noticeable. And it was coming from up high, and gradually getting louder as it neared us, and as it got lower. It reminded me of an orangutan or a gorilla, the way it swung from each branch, and can hear its hands gripping each one, and snapping smaller limbs in its way. It was coming in our direction. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'm crazy until my friend turned around quick and was looking up high in the trees. She asked me, "Do you hear that?" I turned white and felt the air get heavier from whatever vibes were emanating from this thing. As I came down the stairs, she staring into the trees looking upwards. I glanced and saw branches moving. I yelled at her to get out of there quick, pulling her toward the direction of the car. We turned our backs to the woods when this loud whack landed just behind me, and all the hairs on my body stood straight up. I felt like it had a log or a large thick branch in its hand, and it smacked the ground with it. I stood paralyzed with fear. The air was thicker and different when whatever it was landed directly behind me. I could feel the force of it, and it brought tears to my eyes, and it was the weirdest feeling to have come over me. It felt like it was crushing every inch of my body without even touching me. And to hurt so bad, it brought tears to my eyes and made me shake uncontrollably. And the fear that it made me feel was just too much to bear. Hands down, one of the scariest moments that I've ever encountered. I couldn't shake it. So, we went to White Castle and were both shook to our core, and I'm in disbelief of what we just witnessed. We came back and turned the brights on in our car and let them light up the woods for a good 20 minutes before we felt it was safe to go back inside. The only weapon I had in sight was a golf club. She told me she had seen it, high in the trees, and it looked almost like an owl, but with weird features. Later on, she told me a story about when she was a teenager. She thought she was going to get taken off the back of a motorcycle by a huge owl swooping down toward her. And I told a friend about this a few months later, and somehow remembered whatever these things are, they feed off of fear. I don't know where I remember this from, or why these thoughts randomly popped into my head. It's almost like something else is telling me.